People began thinking about nuclear energy. Private sector interests began emerging about new nuclear power in the early 2000s because natural gas prices were high then. It was before the fracking boom. There were projections that electricity was going to grow, and people knew nuclear energy had a role to play. And you had this investment happening naturally, organically, was happening. And politicians do like what politicians do. They decided we're here to help. So they passed the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which had in it subsidies for about 5 or 6 reactors. And that was supposed to kickstart the industry. What actually happened, it distorted capital flows. You got all of this investment coming towards nuclear. That all seemed great at the time. Look, the Energy Policy Act was working. We're getting all this investment. But then when the market shifted, all that was overinvestment, and it made the crash that much worse. My point is, had we taken that momentum, that thinking that we had at the time, that nuclear power had a real opportunity, and focused our attention on fixing the underlying problems that increase the cost of it, that make the subsidies necessary, we might have been in a far better place. Maybe we would have been at the beginning of a nuclear renaissance. And that's the work that I've been doing since then. And that's what I'm trying to address here, because we are sitting at the precipice of another opportunity for another nuclear renaissance, resurgence, or what I think we need, a revolution. Kirk Sorensen, who is the president and chief technologist at Flibe Energy. We'll learn more about Flibe. I'm sure Kirk can't answer a question without saying how awesome Flibe is. And David Brown, who is a senior vice president at Constellation Energy. He's a senior vice president for federal affairs and public policy. Lots going on, lots of money going towards nuclear. It almost seems as if all the problems have been solved.
Things that come to mind first are continued regulatory vigilance. I think that our friends on Capitol Hill did a great job this year of getting the ADVANCE Act through with important regulatory reforms. That was done on a broad bipartisan basis. I think the NRC is receptive to the recommendations in there and the directives in there. Nuclear fuel supply is part of the supply chain that really needs some serious focus. We really need to reshore conversion and enrichment here in the U.S. And then trying to figure out how to manage the regulatory risk of completing reactors.
Issues around the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, I know this is something you and I have talked a lot about, remain kind of persistently unaddressed. I probably spend more time than most nuclear people talking to anti-nuclear people. And I want to find out, why do they have these negative feelings about nuclear energy? I feel very, very positive about it. Extremely thankful for nuclear energy. Where I live in Huntsville, Alabama, is powered by Browns Ferry Nuclear Power Plant, one of the largest and oldest power plants in the U.S. But when I talk to people who are feeling against it, there's persistent concern about the generation of long-term spent nuclear fuel without a clear disposition pathway. And I consider this to be an entirely legitimate question. Where I disagree with them is the idea that this means that we should stop using nuclear power. I point out that if we stopped today, we would still have all of this spent nuclear fuel, and you would not have an answer to address it. But I do think that is something that needs to be tackled much more seriously. I don't see a lot of efforts going on in that direction. Most of the efforts that you alluded to, a lot of businesses, a lot of things going on right now, they are going on, but nearly none of them are talking about addressing some of these longer term concerns. So shore up the building so that we will be able to move and go forward. And dealing with a fuel cycle, onshoring of enrichment and conversion, as was pointed out, as well as dealing with plans for the back end, which I'm sure is no secret to you that I'm one of the few points we disagree on.
I do support Yucca. I don't support the program within the context that it currently exists.
Yeah, I didn't want to derail on Yucca.
But I want to follow up on this nuclear waste question, because I think that's a big problem with the conversation that's going on right now. It's part of what's baked into the original question, which is everything fine? And I just spent a few days at a conference on nuclear energy. Issue of waste as a policy matter didn't come up at all. And I think that is something that is missing from the conversation right now. And I think it's important, not just for the reasons, Kirk, that you pointed out, but it's essential to the future of nuclear energy, not just to be allowed to build more nuclear power plants, but connecting the front end to the back end from a technological and economic standpoint creates the incentives to move the technology forward. That's been my argument.
There's no incentive for anybody to do absolutely anything on this. The federal government, even though they've got a statutory responsibility and they are reimbursing utilities for failing to meet that obligation, the damages are being paid out of the judgment fund. Nobody is accountable. Nobody sees the pain. From a state commission perspective, utilities are no longer paying the nuclear waste fee because the program is in such a state of disarray that federal courts have suspended collection of the fee. So they like that. That's a benefit for customers. For those of us who have reactors, that material is being safely managed on site, relatively little or no cost because the federal government's largely reimbursing us for that failure to execute. Recall that they were supposed to begin moving fuel on January 31st, 1998. Nothing's happened. There are about, a dozen, maybe a few more sites around the country where the only thing left on the site is the spent fuel. And we really need to address that issue.
There's not only value in providing the services of waste management, but also whether it's potential fuel for future reactors, isotopes, all of these things are in the waste. If we could have a system that would allow the economic value of both the management and disposition, but also the extraction of valuable resources, who knows what the market would yield? Now, Kirk, I know you've thought a lot about that side of it.
A little bit of metallurgy and science here, but it's in a ceramic form. It's an oxide. It's not very different than your coffee cup. And to get it into a salt form, a fluoride form. And before that sounds weird, we actually do this on the front end all the time. We take all uranium dioxide fuel we mine and we turn it into uranium fluoride in order to enrich it. We actually have to turn it back into oxide in order to fuel reactors with.
So would all this fluoride that RFK is going to pull out of the water supply be useful for you?
I'm so excited about that. Yeah, I love fluorine and fluorides.
All right, good.
And I want to turn spent nuclear fuel into fluorides. But here's the magic of fluorides, though, is they melt. They melt at much lower temperatures than oxides do. And once you've got them melted, you can actually use electrochemistry to go tease out these things you were talking about. So we can go and say, I would like to pull various isotopes out. That becomes feasible in a way that's extraordinarily difficult to do with the fuel the way it is now. But when we talk to the federal government, they look at us like, we can't even have this conversation. And then we talk to utilities, they say, well, what does the federal government think? Because they're the ones on the hook for it. It's not our problem anymore, as you pointed out very accurately.
The set of policies were perhaps legitimate, credible, and successful. After the Cold War, things like megatons to megawatts, being a skeptic of government intervention into markets, how can we, as a matter of policy, reshore our uranium and our nuclear fuel industrial base without creating these distortions that lead us to a worse place in the future?
There are four enrichers in the world right now, China and Russia, obviously deeply state-owned enterprises. And then you've got Urenco and Orano in Europe, state-supported, not state-owned. In the U.S., we used to be state-owned. It used to be part of the Department of Energy. Then, as you said, was privatized. That entity really became a broker under megatons to megawatts. The utility sector will tell you that we need more competition and more competitors in that market. And the Nuclear Fuel Security Act kind of sets the stage for doing that.
I'm glad you talked about megatons to megawatts and the distortions it introduced into the market. Forgive me if I'm just going to focus on the negatives for a moment, but megatons to megawatts did a lot of damage to the potential of new nuclear enrichment in the country for the simple reason that it brought in an enormous amount of equivalent separative work units, SWUs. These are the nerdy words we call how to separate uranium. And by essentially flooding the market with cheap, effective SWUs, enormous disincentive for American companies to produce new enrichment capability. We could have seen this coming when we did megatons to megawatts, that we were going to really disincentivize ourselves to building new enrichment plants. And that's precisely what happened. So we've been kind of surfing on really, really cheap uranium enrichment that happened a long time ago in Russia. And then even after that, we were coasting along on cheap legacy enrichment from Russia that, they amortized plants, a long time ago, and they would sell us SWUs for very little money. And we loved it. It was wonderful. We were getting cheap uranium from Canada and we were getting cheap SWUs from Russia. That has changed a lot recently. Uranium ore has tripled in price in the last 5 years. SWUs are up quadruple what they used to be. We're telling Russia that we're not going to import your enriched uranium. A friend of mine predicted this not too long ago, and Russia's turning around now and saying, you're not going to import it after 2028? How about we stop now? We did megatons to megawatts around enriched uranium. We wanted to take bomb-grade enriched uranium, and we wanted to go and turn it into civilian fuel. That's wonderful. But that's only half the story. We had all of this weapons-grade plutonium, and both we and the Russians had it. And we did have a plan to try to use it as fuel. We had a MOX program, and it was fabulously expensive and finally canceled. But we need a story around plutonium, just like we need a story around enriched uranium. Right now, we have no sink for plutonium. We have a sink for enriched uranium. We can downblend it, and we can use it as nuclear fuel, LEU. We have no equivalent sink for plutonium, and we need it. It is just accumulating, and we've got a lot of it in our spent nuclear fuel.
Despite the narrative around nuclear having shifted significantly in the pro-nuclear side, we're still burdened with this legacy of cultural imprint that has largely defined how we regulate nuclear energy. So while people might like nuclear, we still have 50 years of anti-nuclear sentiment that has found its way into the regulatory body, hesitancy to use plutonium as fuel, as Jimmy Carter was so instrumental in doing, poisoning us against the so-called plutonium economy.
Being able to use plutonium as a fuel is the equivalent of enormous amounts of SWUs. So, I mean, if we're sitting here at a SWU deficit for enrichment, and we were able to actually productively employ our legacy plutonium, that would help us plug that gap. Every single day, our reactors are operating and they're producing large amounts of plutonium. That could be a fuel. That could be used productively. If we don't use it productively, it's still there. So I will often ask anti-nuclear people, what's your plan around plutonium? Oh, I hate it. Okay, well, great. You hate it. Doesn't make it go away. It's still here. I'd like to use it to save lives and power cities. We can. Oh, it's for bombs. No, it's for whatever we decide to do with it. You can use technology for good or for evil, and we can do a lot of good with these nuclear materials, enriched uranium, plutonium, other nuclear materials.
Do you have any other ones in mind that you're thinking about when you
I'm
say other?
I'm thinking about thorium a lot because thorium is a future fuel. It's a thing that can become a super fuel called uranium-233. So that's yet another option to go down, because through thorium we could actually consume plutonium while not making any new plutonium. One of the retorts that's often given around the so-called plutonium economy is, well, you're just going to make more plutonium. And I'm like, okay, that's legitimate pushback. There's a way to not do that.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
It's one of the things I usually hear from the government side rather than from the, shall we say, anti-nuclear side.
The United States has a stock of thorium that could be usable for these reactors.
Yeah, every country is blessed with thorium. It's abundant. It's 3 times more common than uranium. We have a single location in Idaho that is arguably the richest thorium mine in the entire Western Hemisphere. We don't even need to touch it because we already bring up thorium through rare earth mining. It is already a waste in processes that we're running right now. But thorium all by itself isn't going to make nuclear energy. You can have a big pile of it and nothing will happen. You've got to start that reactor with something else, whether it's enriched uranium, plutonium, or uranium-233. So it's a pre-fuel. But it's a marvelous pre-fuel because once you can start it, it has the ability, without getting into too many technical details, uranium-233 puts out enough neutrons in fission to continue sustaining the reaction and to allow you essentially to consume thorium as a fuel. So that's a big opportunity for us. Despite being the country that discovered all this and first demonstrated it, we have been actively discouraging research into thorium through the Department of Energy now for many years, much to my frustration. We buried 5,000 metric tons of thorium nitrate into shallow burial in Nevada about 15 years ago. You can go dig that out, and that's a great source of thorium right there. But most importantly, as we speak, the Department of Energy is trying to destroy the unique uranium-233 inventory of the United States. That should be stopped immediately.
Which is created through thorium fission.
When thorium absorbs a neutron, it becomes uranium-233. So uranium-233 is a different material than natural uranium-235 and 238. You can't go dig it up. But once you have it, it is an incredibly effective superfuel for creating more and more and more energy. And again, I see a great opportunity here with addressing our plutonium and spent fuel issues while creating the superfuel simultaneously.
And what you just described is not a theoretical matter. We've actually had what you just described occur.
Jimmy Carter presided over the startup of what was called the Light Water Breeder reactor. It was the last core of the shipping port reactor in Pennsylvania. It operated on a thorium uranium-233 core in its last operational sequence. That was a pressurized water reactor. And what they saw after 5 years of operation was there was more fuel at the end than there was at the beginning because of this process we described. Uranium-233 had sustained the consumption of nuclear energy through thorium. I'm sure Constellation would love reactors that ran 5 years and had more fuel at the end than they did at the beginning.
Absolutely.
So this was actually done. And while I don't believe that exact technical approach is the most sustainable one to take in the future, it was shown to have worked. And it's funny that Carter happened to be the guy overseeing it when it took place.
Now, David, I need to ask you a question. Constellation has made big nuclear news recently with 3 Mile Island.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a number of conversations with people who think they know about stuff, who claim that it's going to take forever. I remember them saying it's permanently shut down. There's no reopening this thing. Yet you are.
Could I jump in for clarification for the audience? There were 2 units at 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't realize, you want to talk about Unit 1 and Unit 2.
Sure. Yeah.
Restarting the other one.
Yeah. So, right. Once upon a time.
That would be impressive if you could get that done.
Yeah. So 3 Mile Island was a 2-unit site. Unit 2 is the site that had the accident, and that is permanently shut. Unit 1, however, was one of the best performing reactors in the world by any metric. At one point, it ran over 700 consecutive days between refueling outages, producing 24/7 carbon-free energy. At the time, that was a world record. It shut down in 2019 for economic reasons. It was just in a bad region that was surrounded by cheap natural gas and subsidized renewables. And the story generally is when you shut down a reactor, you surrender your license to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They change its status from an operating reactor with an operating license to a possession only, where it's awaiting decommissioning. Some of the plant systems were partially dismantled. The reactor core was completely defueled. Usually when you do that, you're kind of at a point of no return. But we didn't continue dismantling it. Our CEO challenged our nuclear team. Well, okay, what would it take? I know we've said that we can't do it, but what would it take? What's the material condition of the plant? Let's take a look. Every system in that plant was walked down and inspected. Independent contractors were brought in to check major components like the steam generators. We had a number of conversations with Microsoft to take the output of that plant. If we could get it restarted, how much would you want? And the answer was all of it. We have committed to restart that plant by 2028. The components that need to be refurbished are all things that we do on a regular basis at our other plants. And so we're very confident that that date is going to hold.
I want to make sure we open it up for Q&A.
How does France handle it? The very high percentage of the electricity in France comes from nuclear. Why aren't we talking about how the French do it, or is there some secret stupidity that they've indulged in?
They run a fleet of light water reactors, not too dissimilar from our own, but they take the spent oxide fuel and they reprocess it through a technique called Purex, where they go and isolate the plutonium and uranium residual in the fuel, and then they send that plutonium back for fabrication into a mixed oxide form called MOX, where instead of using enriched uranium, they actually will use depleted uranium and plutonium as the fuel. They'll put it back into the reactors for some further consumption. They do get more energy out of that, but they don't continue recycling it after that. It is like paying $1 and getting back 70 cents. So the French technique has some improvements over ours, but it also comes at a tremendous amount of state expense. I'm going to be a heretic here and actually say that, in my opinion, the United States actually made the right decision by not pursuing the Purex processing strategy in South Carolina back in the late 1970s. I think we did the right thing for the wrong reasons. I think we could go to a vastly better improvement over that.
Though I want the French to do what works for the French, I would never advocate the French model for the United States. It's a state-owned model. It's a relatively closed model. In the United States, we literally exist in this era of energy abundance. It doesn't take advantage of free markets, innovation, private sector driven, moving things forward. In the United States, if we attempted the French model, people would be like, this costs too much. Let's burn natural gas.
I'm curious, in that year-long period when you guys were investigating what you could do with the 3 Mile Island plant, you were talking about how it seemed sort of infeasible going into it. It was something that you were exploring, but you weren't sure that it was possible. I'm curious, like, what the big problem was that ended up not being a problem or being resolved over the course of that year that really made this something that is not only possible, but you guys are confident you can do quickly?
When the decision was made to shut the plant down, we were putting that power onto the PJM grid. And so we were a price taker. Prices just weren't sufficient to sustain operations. The 20-year PPA with Microsoft gave us that certainty that we would have enough revenue to cover the costs of not only recovering the plant, but continuing to operate it. So I think we were just fortunate in that we had not gone down the decommissioning road so far that it was unrecoverable. For us, it was having that customer pull that allowed us to make that decision.
You and I share a kind of a libertarian view of keeping the government out of energy policy. And one of the areas where government has played a big role in nuclear from the start has been in providing the insurance for these plants. And can these plants be built without requiring, a huge taxpayer liability? I think it was at the Price-Anderson Act.
Price-Anderson.
And the second question is, natural gas is at record low prices, and we have a super abundance of natural gas. Is nuclear going to be competitive, down over the next 10, 20 years, given, the fracking revolution and the abundance of very low priced, reliable natural gas?
Now, being the free enterprise, free market-minded people that we are, I'm comfortable saying I don't know the answer to either of those questions, nor does anyone else. Let me clarify on Price-Anderson real quick, and David can probably do better than me, but I'll do it and then he can correct me. It's unfair to say that Price-Anderson's this big subsidy scheme for nuclear power. The nuclear energy industry pays into it, whether one agrees with it or not. The agreement that was made from a public policy standpoint was that liability would be capped, but you would set aside an immense amount of money that would be readily available. You don't have to go to the courts or anything. It's there. And that's sort of the scheme that's been created, and every nuclear power plant pays into it. And that's that. That's not to say I'm a big defender of it. I'm just saying what it is. I would say further that Price-Anderson was put in place at a time where we didn't have 5 decades of history with nuclear operations. And I can see where, given the national security concerns at the time, wanting to bring the private sector in, providing that liability insurance was appropriate. And it just has evolved from there for what it is. So that all being said, one of the reforms that I think is interesting that I talk about is, let's see if we can get just a purely private sector insurance mechanism going. And if you're able to do that, you should be able to go off and build a reactor with a very light regulatory touch, because I know, as you know, that insurance is essentially regulation. It's a very sophisticated financial tool that assesses risk, and you pay a premium toward that. If small modular reactors, if advanced reactors are what we say they are, which is smaller, simpler, less fuel, all of these things, then they should be able to get insurance, or at least I'm interested in finding out if they can. I'm not for right now on this public stage getting rid of Price-Anderson. I'm for setting up an alternative to see what can emerge, and then maybe we don't need Price-Anderson. Well, let's find out. On the natural gas thing, that's the reason I wrote this book, Steve. That's the reason, because the path we're on, it can't be competitive, because there are too many things that are inherent in the system that artificially inflate costs. What I want to do is allow the market to do for nuclear energy what it has done for large screen TVs and cars, drive up quality, drive down price, so that it serves the most interest for the most people at the price they're willing to pay. And there's no reason nuclear can't do that. There's nothing magical about it. We act like it's magical. It's steel, it's metal, it's fuel. And we have these guys who know how to build and operate nuclear power plants. So I think it can be competitive. I don't know if it can, but let's find out by creating some of these alternative pathways that will allow the markets to do for nuclear what it has done for humanity since the first person decided to put fire to coal, and Adam Smith told us how markets should work.
Let me just give you a little bit of a different way to look at Price-Anderson. It is effectively a no-fault insurance pool, where the first layer of protection is private insurance that we've got to obtain. The next layer comes from the company who owns and operates the plant. The next layer is kind of a pooled layer where every other reactor owner in the United States pays into that in the event of an accident that exceeds those numbers.
The companies pay premiums, right? I mean,
Yes.
they pay for the insurance.
Right.
How many
But-
times have we had to actually pay out money? In terms
None. Zero.
Of, okay.
Never. There's really never been an incident where Price-Anderson's been triggered other than 3 Mile Island and maybe some defense activities, because it covers defense-related nuclear as well. It's been a very, very successful program. The real key that folks don't realize is that because all the utilities share that liability, it makes us very vigilant at policing each other. I'm not just going to worry about my own operations. I'm going to worry about your operations too, because we're all held hostage to the worst performer out there, right? So after 3 Mile Island, the industry created something called the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. It's an entity based in Atlanta. It is kind of, think of it as a mirror to the NRC, where INPO sends inspectors to every reactor in the country every couple of years. These are teams of peers from every utility out there that owns a nuclear power plant, and they do a top to bottom examination of the entire plant. Systems, procedures, process, personnel, everything. It's a very rigorous process. And then they give you a rating on your plant. If your rating isn't one of the top couple of tiers, your CEO is called in to a meeting with all the other CEOs to answer for why your plant's not performing better, tell people what you're going to do to make it better. Price-Anderson actually has a very beneficial internal structure to ensure excellent performance in the U.S., and that's one of the reasons that we operate our reactors better than anybody else in the world.
What you just described with INPO and the extent of the systems from top to bottom with the plant do not apply whatsoever with many of the SMRs and advanced reactors. And yet the industry, the OEMs, the utilities, and the regulators are all treating the SMRs and advanced reactors as if they do. What that means is that the costs aren't going to be reduced. The safety-related border of these new systems essentially is almost at the flange of the reactor in some of them, and maybe one system away at the others. They're not tied to the turbines. Existing light water reactors follow the turbines. The turbines demand more heat. They send a signal to the reactor. You can design these SMRs so that they're not. They can actually fit in a building off. And they have to be engineered. I'm looking at Kirk, and I get the same roll of the eye as I get from everybody.
Well, yes and no. I mean, what you're talking about is you're painting a very broad brush here. I mean, our company's an SMR developer. They're an advanced reactor developer. What's unfortunate to me is that SMR has come to mean a synonym for light water SMR. And of course, SMR is a lot bigger than that. It didn't used to be that way. SMR, they used to be associated with liquid metal reactors, but in general, low pressure reactors. And that's where a lot of these claims about how great SMRs were going to be came from. And I do think SMRs are great, but I see a new scale pressurized water reactor as a whole lot more similar to an AP1000 than I see it as something like to ours, which is a low pressure, inherently safe system. So you've got to be able to look at these risks and say, are there stored energy terms in there? Some reactors have stored energy terms. Obviously, pressurized water reactors do, liquid metal reactors do. That's the driving force that can liberate activity out into the environment, which comes back to Price-Anderson, which is our concern about insurance and touching back on some of those issues. The older I get, the more convinced I am the world runs on insurance. If you doubt, go to the hospital and count how long it is till they want to look at your little magic card. You know, everything runs on insurance. You don't run a car without insurance. You don't go to the hospital on insurance, and you sure don't run a nuclear reactor. Much like megatons to megawatts, perhaps one of the downsides of the pool of Price-Anderson has been that it has not caused developers and operators to go and say, God, could we be doing this better? Could we go and remove the trouble that we have in these designs that might actually trigger a Price-Anderson event or a radioactivity excursion beyond the boundary? What if we had an approach that was unpressurized? What if we had no driving terms? What if we had chemical stability? Wouldn't we want that? There would be economic pressure to go and say, I want to build one of those, like your council of CEOs saying, my goodness, this guy has a machine that doesn't have that problem. I want more of those in my fleet and less of these potential liabilities that I might experience. And one final point on this that I wanted to make, and I'm indebted to Jack Devaney for suggesting it, look at classification societies for ships. Shipping is a very dangerous activity, yet we have organizations around the world, the ABS, we have Lloyd's of London, we have Bureau Veritas, and they privately finance this. They do it by looking and assessing the risk and telling people what it's going to cost to insure your ship to go do something or another. they compete. If one is too expensive, people go and say, I don't want ABS, I want Bureau Veritas. And so they have an inherent mechanism to prevent them from going too crazy. On the other hand, if they don't do a good enough job, people go, my goodness, that guy said that ship was going to operate. It sunk and I lost everything. So there's that natural frisson there within a free market to go and find somebody who will go and say, look, I want you to do the safest thing, but I also know that it's got to make money too. So I think there's a great opportunity to look at classification societies and global shipping and draw a parallel there with what we could be doing with nuclear energy.
And with that, final thoughts.
We're in this era where uranium has tripled in price, SWUs have quadrupled in price. We are, as the gentleman talked about, we're in an era of cheap natural gas, and we cannot afford to operate at a time when nuclear fuel is costing more than natural gas. We just won't. We not only won't build them, we won't run them. We've got to look really, really hard at lower cost options for nuclear energy and things that take advantage of our unique geopolitical advantages here in North America. And I would just strongly encourage us to do it and think really hard. Otherwise, we're going to find our nuclear option potentially evaporating.
And I'd just say the future for nuclear is bright. I mean, I think if the next 4 years are going to be focused on American energy abundance, which I think is the right way to go, and given the demand for electricity that we're going to have, nuclear's got a vital role to play. So, a couple of important things related to that. One is personnel. I think the administration's off to a good start on the energy front in terms of announcements there, but you got to fill in a lot of slots at the Department of Energy, especially the Office of Nuclear Energy. Hopefully, they'll have somebody who is focused on new plant deployment. The other big key is going to be get out of the way. I think that nuclear, including existing nuclear, has a phenomenal role to play in meeting the AI data revolution challenge. Reliable, clean power 24/7 a day, which is what these data centers need. But we need to make sure that the policies don't discourage us from doing that.
Well, my final thoughts are to thank both of you for joining me on the stage for the release of my book. Thank you both sincerely. I do appreciate it.